Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it's time for another worst to best ranking. Alright, I know some people are sick of me making videos about Four Tet, but thankfully for those people, we've made it to the last one I'm gonna be doing on him for a long time. Or at least I hope so. I'd prefer Hebden actually take his time with his next studio album. But yes, since hopefully it'll be a while before he drops another one, and since this is the last format left I have to actually talk about Four Tet before the topic of his music is exhausted entirely on this channel, here we are, I'm ranking his studio albums. We're finishing off this series once and for all. So, I don't really have much intro, so let's just get the disclaimers out of the way. This is just my opinion, you can feel free to disagree with it. While I don't think the top or the bottom of this ranking is gonna surprise many people, or the kind of thing that I expect to see that many people arguing with me on, there were a few rankings in the middle that ended up kind of surprising me. And hey, if you do happen to love the albums that I have at the bottom of my ranking, that's fine. Feel free to post your own rankings in the comments if you feel so inclined. The other thing is that I may not necessarily agree with this video myself in the future. It only reflects how I currently feel at the moment and may not reflect how I feel in a month. Though I have a feeling my thoughts aren't going to super fundamentally change, at least not for a long time. But you never know. I mean, this ranking is also very different than it would have been if you had asked me in like 2017. But yeah, may as well just get into it. Fingers crossed this doesn't get as completely screwed by the copyright bots as the top 10 video did. This is Four Tet, worst to best. At number 11, I have Parallel. This one doesn't feel like it should even count. Like, everything about this project reads to me as a thrown together compilation of outtakes and ideas that wouldn't have been good enough to make a different main album of his. The pacing is ridiculously lopsided thanks to starting with a 26-minute ambient piece, and everything after that just feels like rehashes of ideas that he's already done before but not as well executed. And after sitting through all his other albums and really analyzing them in depth, coming back to this is just so obvious to me that he didn't care about this one to the same level as a 16 Oceans or a New Energy, both from the out-of-nowhere release with zero lead-up, and from the fact that a bunch of the material from here had already been released under that Wingdings alias. But what's made this feel especially inexcusable is that I've heard other archive compilations from this guy that are way more consistently enjoyable and have more heart put into them than this. 0181 and Randoms are just as scattershot, if not even more so, but this doesn't even come close to being as fun to listen as those were. It's more akin to that one album he put out under the name Percussions, which also didn't feel like it had much thought put into its overall construction, and only had one track on it I thought it could stand among Four Tet's best. But even that project, that was him still, like, first experimenting with house music and getting the hang of it, and that actually was marked as a side project. It lived up to what it was actually marketed as. While this album's much prettier than the Percussions one, and doesn't have low points as low, it also has none of his best work, and no track that hits the level of even ASCII-Bot. It's just overlong and meandering more than anything. None of these tracks really feel like they go anywhere, and Hebden sounds like he's on autopilot the whole way through. Given his Pink album was technically more of a compilation than even this was, I can't fully justify discounting this one as an album on the same grounds. But aside from the opening ambient piece, this thing has only shrunk on me more and more since my review of it, and it's one of those listens that can fairly easily get me to understand why Four Tet has a whole bunch of detractors who believe all his music is boring and overrated. I obviously don't agree on a general level, but I know he can do so much better than this, and I'd hope that he knows that too. Whoosh. At number 10, I have Beautiful Rewind.
Hey, hey, hey!
Well, this album has a few things that put it over Parallel. For one thing, it's much shorter. I believe it's his shortest album to date. It doesn't feel like a slog. There's a bit more of a distinct vision to this one with the addition of all the pirate radio samples. I do believe that Hebden actually put his heart into it and treated it as a proper album, even if he was also hoping to approach this in a way that he hadn't really before. And it does have the slight advantage of being from the time when Four Tet going microhouse was still more of a novelty and not just the general expectation. I've even heard him incorporate a few of these tracks in his live sets and know that they work really well in that context. But in this studio context, this album feels like a bunch of fragmented scraps. Tracks meant to be used as transitional devices in his sets rather than the main attraction. And aside from a few isolated moments like Ba Teaches Yoga or Cool FM, this project feels really thin and undercooked, especially in its second half. I'm of the opinion that later period Four Tet albums are, like, minimalistic in the sense that they make great use of very simplistic compositions that can have very few elements but still manage to be easily memorable and replayable. But sticking to ideas this scant can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because if the ideas you stick with aren't amazing, then you're just going to be left underwhelmed. Beautiful Rewind isn't brilliant in its simplicity, it's just kinda there. You come out of it thinking, that's it? It does have enough good moments, especially in its first half, that I still see myself hanging on to it. I'm still a lot more likely to remember the hooks and grooves from here than I am with Parallel, but it's absolutely not essential listening or a particularly good showcase for why I hold Four Tet in such high regard. Whoopsh. At number 9, I have Everything Ecstatic. Well, unlike the last two albums, Everything Ecstatic is definitely not boring. It's a project that showed him being somewhat disillusioned with much of his older music getting written off by some critics as folktronica, and like pretty but shallow background music. And he decided he needed to prove to people that he could be daring and experimental too, and he very much delivered something that would qualify as such. It's his most abrasive and least welcoming project. Tons of rough guitars, crashing drums, squealing electronics. It shows that he does in fact have more dimensionality than maybe some people might make him out to have. But it's also one of his least replayable. Like, once the shock of how out there the album is wears off, the more abrasive elements kind of end up not as engaging and really only leaving a few tracks like Smiler on the Face, Sun Drums and Soil, and then Patterns really holding up as they retain some more of the core appeal of his previous stuff as seen on Rounds. Stuff that could be just as mood-brightening as this album cover would imply. And on top of that, the 10 tracks on here just don't really fit together or feel like they coalesce together into a greater whole much at all. It's just a fragmented collection of random ideas, many of which seem designed to throw off his listeners and force himself out of his comfort zone rather than play to his actual strengths. And you know, I can definitely respect it for that. I like how it sounds unlike anything else in his catalog, and I honestly kind of wish he made riskier moves like this more often, but it is just not one I actually come back to that much. Whoopsh. At number 8, I have Dialogue. Dialogue. Boy, did going through this guy's entire catalog in depth do weird things to my thoughts on this project. If you had asked me a few years ago, I probably would have considered this project to sit in the higher tier of his catalog, since I was more of a fan of like his earlier, jazzier, sample-based work. And I still think it's quite solid for what it is, with no moments that I outright dislike. But its flaws have kind of become clearer and clearer to me as time has gone on. I think the production can get a bit spotty in many parts. I think there's quite a few tracks, especially in the first half, that aren't really that interesting. Like, I could have sworn that opener was stronger than it was. And these sounds don't always blend as well as they could in later projects of his in this style. While other albums like Pause and Round sounded like they could have been played by real bands, that this project was all being cut together out of samples is really obvious. Not to mention, I think the majority of this project's quality is gathered in its final stretch. While the bulk of the album was fairly chill and laid back and perfectly fine in that way, the end of this album starts to go a lot more abrasive and experimental, and in a way that's a lot more replayable and engaging than the stuff on Everything Ecstatic. He's putting together his own crazy free jazz improvisations, except he's assembling them out of samples, and it's great. Which makes it all the more frustrating that he cut the last 3 tracks from the album on digital versions and moved them over to the Misnomer EP, where people are a lot less likely to find them. I mean, sure, the Butterfly Effect does make for an equally good closer in its own right, but the album's just not the same without that last section. Still, coming back to it one more time for this video, I still have a lot of good memories attached to this album and still think it has a lot of great moments. This is the part of the ranking where all the really good stuff comes in. I just think the formulas he's explored here were a lot better refined later on. Whoosh. At number 7, I have Pink. Even though this project is technically a compilation of singles he'd already released beforehand, I've always recognized it as a proper album of his and feel like it's easily well-developed, well-paced, and cohesive enough to work as one. Like, this feels like our proper introduction to the microhouse phase of Four Tet's career that he stuck to ever since. Like, a proof of concept that he could focus entirely within this genre, but before he continued to drop more of the warmer, sample-based influences that colored his earlier work. And sure, not every track on here is as great as the next. Tracks like Lion or 128 Harps can feel a bit too thin and like I need to be in the right mood for, but it's also got some of his best ever tracks like Pyramid and Pinnacles with unbelievably top-notch grooves, and even some of the more ambient-leaning cuts like Jupiter's or Peace for Earth work really well in the overall sound of the project, and feel like defining moments for him that he'd keep trying to recapture the magic of. Often successfully. It does end a lot stronger than it starts and isn't his most consistent, but it was a great proof of concept for this whole latter half of his career. It has no moments that I'd want taken out, and the standouts on here still stand among the absolute best he has to offer and make it worth the experience on their own. Just short of greatness, and I think we only got like 8 out of 10 material going upwards from here. Whoopsh. And number 6, I have New Energy. This is an album that's taken up a lot of my brain space over the last couple of years. When it first came out in 2017, I gave it at least like 10 full listens, trying to figure out the best possible conditions to get the most out of it, but just not clicking with me much at all outside of a few isolated tracks. When I reviewed it, I was ready to call it his weakest project to date, and for the entire following year I marked it as one of the single biggest letdowns I'd had out of an artist I loved in years. And then he dropped the Live at Funkhouse Berlin set. I listened to the whole thing and found that I was getting most excited to hear tracks from this album in this context. And I went back to the album itself and found I was getting way more out of it than I remembered. And as the years have gone by, this thing's only significantly grown on me even more. When it comes to Four Tet's lowest key microhouse material, this is the project where most of the stuff I'm most likely to think about in that vein appears. Like, all the time I spent early on trying my absolute hardest to force this stuff to click with me ended up eventually paying off, as I now find a lot of the material here a lot catchier and more striking in its meditative minimalism than I initially gave it credit for. Sure, not every track is a gem, and it does run on a tad long, but there are a lot of gems all over it. 2017, Lush, Scientists, SW99SL, Planet, even some of the ambient moments like ALAP, 10 MIDI, and LA Trance have really stuck with me. The latter's kind of become the first track I think of when I think of his plinky ambient synth compositions, even if I probably prefer Peace for Earth over it. LA Trance is just stuck in my head more. Still, while it's hardly a masterpiece, and I will understand if it still left you underwhelmed, it did take me a really long time to warm up to it, but once it finally did click, it ended up becoming one of my favorites from him. And it kinda astonishes me that it's ended up almost on par with this next pick. Whoopsh. At number 5, I have Pause. You know, if you'd asked me before doing this series, I would have guessed that this was going to rank much higher than it actually is. Like, back when I was first getting into Four Tet, back in my early college days, this album was my shit. And I still think it's great. It shows Hebden's sample-based formulas really being finessed to a level that made him stand out from the crowd. None of the album sounds like it was made out of samples. It sounds like it was all coming from one small-time acoustic folk band with maybe a few touches of jazziness or electronic influence. Not like it's being assembled out of lots of similar-sounding, already existing sample sources. It's really well executed and cohesive, and has such a warm and organic low-key charm that you can't really get out of any other album. Which made it stranger that it's not really resonated with me as strongly as it used to in my most recent visits. Like, there have been a few cuts on here, especially the closer hilarious movie of the 90s that are, like, so saccharine that feel like they belong in some kind of fast food commercial, and as cohesive as it is, I can't say it's the project of his I've found his most consistent or replayable. Heck, I'd even considered ranking New Energy above it, given how much it's grown on me over the years. That would have been crazy. But then I gave this thing one more solid re-listen, and no, this is still great. Even the closer is still pretty good. It may be too easy to imagine some smarmy announcer voice trying to sell you something over it, but it doesn't feel insincere on its own. This album has, like, just such a light and welcoming tone to everything, but never feels like it's obnoxiously cheery. There's a slight undercurrent of melancholy to many of these tracks, and the ones where that lonelier and more nostalgic vibe ends up more pronounced, like on Parks, tend to ends out anymore. but it all comes together really well. It's not a mind-blowing release or anything, not that most Four Tet albums are, but it is just such a nice, friendly, unpretentious listen that can just put you in a better mood, or at least tries its best to. It does still hold up, just, a tiny bit less than I remembered. And some newer projects like this next one somewhat unexpectedly ended up overtaking it recently. And number 4, I have Morning Evening. Like Pause, this isn't an album I'm in the mood to listen to all the time. Sometimes its repetitive, monolithic nature can wear me down, but man did my thoughts on this one shoot upwards once I really looked into it and covered it in depth. This one benefits a lot from having figured out how personal it was to Hebden himself, how it was kind of made in response to his grandmother's passing and him finding the core sample that drives Morningside while going through her old record collection mostly consisting of Indian devotional music. Feeling like he had been losing touch with his roots, he put together this project that was heavily inspired by the music from that area, right down to the concept based on Indian ragas, which are typically associated with specific times of day, like a morning rag or an evening rag. Hearing the backstory behind this album made Morningside that much more of an emotional gut punch than it had ever been before. But on top of that, when I really thought about what critics pointed to it as its biggest drawbacks, being the simplicity and repetitiveness of these two pieces feeling overbearing, the less I really bought into them as being a problem. It's the kind of project that works better digested in the same way as, an ambient drone album. Not really the kind of thing you pay attention to the overall progression. He just creates these musical moments that feel like you could stay in forever and never get old. Just the kind of thing you zone out to and let go of your sense of time. And sure, the albums I have ranked above this one do feel like they have a lot more dimensionality and are better fleshed out, but man, if there's any project that proves that later period Four Tet isn't putting any less heart into his work, despite the more simplistic house compositions, it's Morning Evening. Well, that and the next pick. At number 3, I have 16 Oceans. Yeah, even after going through his full catalog and thoroughly picking it apart, 16 Oceans has only stood up to me as among Hebden's absolute best work, and pretty much the best iteration of his whole later period minimal microhouse phase. The one thing I have noticed is that it has very few tracks that I would individually consider among his best. A lot of the ideas explored here are once again very scant and don't always stand on their own. I'd even get it if some people thought this project showed him watering down ideas he's already done. But to me, it's not so much any one track that makes this album work so well, it's the full package and the way it all comes together as a whole. The fact that we got 16 tracks and every single one brings something different and interesting in its own rights that none of the other tracks do, even the interludes, which is rare for those to feel like they matter on Four Tet albums. And they all connect together and build towards the same sense of environment. It feels like he's building his own miniature world out of these low-key house and ambient styles, and there's not a single weak point to be found anywhere. The project is always fairly simple in its sound and construction, but it's never boring. The synth tones and acoustic textures are so clean and refreshing and make me feel like I'm looking through a freshwater lake that has absolutely no pollution at all, and the water is so clear that you can see all the way to the bottom. I already marked it as my number 3 favorite album of last year, and it's not remotely shrunk on me since then. And that basically just leaves the top 2, both of which should not surprise anyone who's even just heard me talk about this guy in passing. Whoopsh. At number 2, I have There's Lovin' You. Yep, between the eras of Microhouse Four Tet and Jazz Breaks Four Tet, we got that one album of IDM Four Tet. The project he seemed to pack the most detail and texture into his sound design, even if the mixes he went about exploring here were no less refreshing and low-key as everything else he's ever put out under this name. The amount of work that went into this project is most obvious on the surface level than any of his other ones. The loops he focuses on are a lot more glitchy and abstract, there's a lot of sonic variety, but it all comes together under the same sound and feels perfectly cohesive, and there's not a single track that feels less important a part of the album than any other. Every moment is just as high effort and striking as the next. From the catchy vocal chops of Angel Echoes to the quirky, high-energy pluckiness of Sing and the splashy club beats of Plastic People, to the low-key but deceptively epic buildup of Love Cry, to the lower-key, floaty, heartfelt experimentations of This Unfolds and She Just Likes to Fight, it all adds up to an experience that you can't get anything quite like elsewhere in the whole world of electronic music. I already marked it as one of my favorite albums of 2010 and one of my favorite albums of that whole decade, and even one of my favorites of all time. Needless to say, it's kinda held up as a modern classic of sorts, but even if I love this thing anytime I put it on, it's still not a project I actually put on super often these days. At least nowhere near to the same extent as the obvious top pick. Whoopsh. At number 1, I have Rounds. I mean, was it ever gonna be anything else? Four Tet can sometimes be the kind of artist which I need to be in the right mood to properly get into, but Rounds is not an album I need to be in any specific mood to enjoy. This is like the definitive anytime album for me. This album already made my top 30 favorites of all time back in 2016, and I've listened to it probably hundreds of times over the past 8 years or so. It's an album that I know if I listen to it like 8 times in a short period of time, then I'll get sick of it. But I also know that because it's happened at least 3 times in the past because I just couldn't help it. I've just always absolutely adored the jazzy mishmash of samples he uses that always sound so instrumentally dense, but everything always blends so well together. Even if not every track feels like it's being played by the same band as On Pause, it feels like every track could have been played by a real band. Like 8 different bands, depending on the track, with each one retaining its own sort of feel and personality apart from everything else. But it also never feels incohesive or like it doesn't all fit together either. It's hard to sum up in a quick little segment like this. It's a project that I hold very close to me personally, but I also feel like it's a super immediate listen and the kind of thing you don't need to be a Four Tet fan at all in order to get into. It's the place I'd most highly recommend first-time listeners to start with. I have nothing but the highest praises to sing towards every single bit of it. I already knew it would have been the top pick here, even if you asked me before I started this channel at all. And yeah, I don't know what else to say. I just freaking love Rounds. And I think I'm gonna leave it at that. And yeah, that's the ranking. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make your review, something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.